I've been asked to speak on a fairly large subject. What does it mean to be human? And I have to promise you only disappointment. There's no way I'm going to be able to answer that question. If anyone now feels they would like to leave, I'll understand. There's probably still time to get dinner somewhere. And all I can say is it is such a large and daunting and difficult question, and it's possible to get it embarrassingly wrong. And let me just start with the story of Diogenes the Cynic. Some of you may know this story, but Diogenes lived in ancient Greece from 412 to 323 BC, and he was a bit of an eccentric. He, as you saw there, lived in a large clay pot. He hung out with dogs, and the word cynic comes from the word from dog in Greek. He went about nearly naked, and he did strange things like carry that lamp around in broad daylight, and he would say when asked, apparently, I'm looking for an honest man, and I see nothing but beasts and brutes. He also did other things which don't bear talking about. He was scolded for public masturbation and other things, but he was also a philosopher, and he was known to be something of a challenge to Plato's academy. So Plato was running his academy at around this time, and Diogenes made it a habit to annoy and pester Plato and his academy. And at one time, and again this may all be apocryphal, but at one time Plato was asked to define what makes people human, what is it to be human, and he came up with the following definition. Humans are featherless bipeds, that is, we walk on 2 feet and we don't have feathers unlike birds. And what Diogenes did was he plucked a chicken and presented it to Plato and said, this is a Platonic human. So you can get it quite wrong. So what I'm going to do is change the question cunningly. Although I was asked by Sophie to speak on one question, I'm going to change it a little bit from what does it mean to be human to be what do people think it means to be human, and in the process move this from an unsolvable philosophical problem to a more tractable psychological one, and hopefully you don't feel too cheated in the process. So what I'm going to do, to give you an overview, I'm going to start off talking about some work on ideas of humanness, what people think constitutes our being human. And that will explore some of the research I and colleagues and international collaborators have done, and also lead into some work on dehumanization, because you would think that to know what dehumanization is, you need to have a working understanding about what humanness is. What is it that we deny to people when we dehumanize them? And surprisingly enough, until fairly recently, people didn't tend to do that. I'll talk a little bit about ape metaphors as one particular form of dehumanization, this persisting idea that some people are more primitive and ape-like or simian than others. Do a little bit more of a discussion about animal metaphors more broadly, not just those to do with apes, and we'll then touch on this exhibit a little bit for my thoughts. And I'm not an art critic, so they may be somewhat shallow, but at least you'll be getting hungry and maybe you won't notice by that point. So, let's start off with this idea of humanness. Lots of people, far smarter and more important than I, have speculated on what it is to be human, on what constitutes the human condition. And people have pontificated and come up with a variety of attributes that they thought to be defining of our species and how we live. So let's just give a random assortment from a dictionary of quotations. So you can see at the top there, Pierre de Beaumarchais, who was a French polymath. He said, "Only this distinguishes us from other animals. We drink when we're not thirsty." Maybe not one that would have sprung to your mind as the core of humanity, but this idea that somehow we're not creatures of unbridled appetite, maybe that's what he was trying to get across. The first economist, the Scot Adam Smith, said, "The propensity to truck, barter and exchange one thing for another is to be found in no other race of animals." Again, people tend to project onto humanity what they themselves find most interesting, in this case, the dismal science. English essayist William Hazlitt, "Man is the only animal that laughs and weeps." Again, an unusual choice perhaps. Joseph de Maistre, the concept of number is the obvious distinction between beast and man. We do maths, they don't. And Mark Twain, man is the only animal that blushes or needs to, having to do about emotion, and a particular kind of emotion, in particular self-conscious, embarrassed emotion, the emotion that I would feel if I was Plato and given a plucked chicken. And what you'll notice there is that there's a diversity of ideas about what is this distinctive property that makes humans different from animals. But that's actually the key point here. It's not that there is this diversity, it's that always these quotes are comparing humans to a particular kind of contrastive being that is animals. The human-animal distinction seems to be the common sense way that people have of understanding what is human. What makes us human is what makes us different from other beasts. Now, I thought that was something that probably needed to be investigated a little bit more carefully. So with some colleagues, some of whom at the time were working at Brisbane, we did something very, very simple-minded, which was rather than speculate philosophically about what is human or what is humanness, we just asked people, a very radical thing for a psychologist to do, I should say. We essentially got a bunch of people from several different parts of the world, an Australian sample, an Italian sample, and a Chinese sample, and we simply asked them to write a few attributes that they thought were core to being human. And again, I'm not sure how often graphs get presented in art museums, but this is a sort of summary of what comes out. We classified the kinds of things that people spontaneously came up with as parts of humanness, and we classified them into a number of different types. So some people talked about abilities, cognitive abilities to do with intelligence. Some talked about emotions. Some talked about personality characteristics like being warm or friendly or aggressive. Some people talked about physical attributes, attributes of our bodily being. Some talked about aspects of our macro societies and cultures. Some talked about values. A number of people talked about how we have this capacity for language. And what we simply did was see what proportion of our samples in those three different cultural backgrounds tended to mention at least one of these different kinds of attributes. And the results are, I think, non-obvious. What people tended to spontaneously come up with in each of these places primarily was cognitive abilities and other mental attributes. It's not self-evident that humanness would be about mental properties, but most of the sorts of things that people listed when deciding what was human were about mind, abilities, emotions, personality, values, our capacity for language, etc. Very few people talked about physical attributes, rather few talked about our wonderful societies and cultures. They didn't define humanness, mind did, and particular kinds of mind. And there was a certain kind of commonality across these rather different cultures, Australian, Chinese, and Italian. That is, abilities were first or second in importance, in most commonly being cited in each of the three samples. And yet also there were significant differences. So if you look at the emotions, you'll see Australians, when asked to say what constitutes humanness, tend to mention emotions more than twice as much as Chinese people did, with Italians somewhere in between. And likewise, the Chinese, and to a lesser extent the Italians, tended to think more about cognitive abilities like intelligence and language more so than us. So there is diversity, and maybe that's interesting, this idea of how people from different backgrounds think about what it is to be human, a really fundamental question that no one had actually bothered to study. Now, you might think here, didn't you just say that humanness is defined spontaneously in terms of what distinguishes us from animals? And surely emotions don't distinguish us from animals, because a lot of small furry animals do experience emotions. So what's going on here? And we asked that question in some follow-up work, because we wondered, is it the case that all of humanness is defined just in terms of a comparison to non-human animals? What we did was we gave people a large number of attributes, characteristics, and we simply asked people to judge or rate the extent to which those attributes were one of two things. to what extent is this characteristic distinctive or unique to humans vis-a-vis animals? And we also asked, to what extent is this characteristic a feature of human nature, using the word human nature? We thought those two questions, human nature and unique to humans, would be synonyms. But it turned out people think about humanness in very, very different ways, and those two questions, those two ideas, being distinctive to our species versus being part of our human nature, turned out to be completely unrelated. Different sorts of characteristics were thought to be constitutive of human nature than were thought to be unique to our species. Give you an example, and I'll just get to the right slide here while I'm doing it. Politeness. Who thinks politeness is part of human nature? One arm shoots up, or a few others. And it may be you're right. This is not a question of what's right or wrong. A lot of people would not agree with you. Not that they're right. Often people will say, well, politeness is something that actually quite a number of us don't have. It's not part of our shared humanity. It's somewhat rare, possibly getting rarer. It's something that you have to sort of strive for, and maybe those ill-behaved millennials don't have enough of it, etc. What about curiosity? People are more likely to think that curiosity, at least in our samples, is part of human nature. Now, is curiosity, a deep part of human nature, unique to our species? Of course not. Lots of other creatures have it. Cats have it. It kills them. But there is a sort of disjunction here between what is part of human nature and what is unique to humans. Politeness is unique to humans, but many people would not see it as being a deep-seated part of what makes us human, rightly or wrongly. Whereas curiosity, not unique to humans, but many people would say a deep-seated part of who we are as a species. And what seemed to come out of this unexpected finding from about 14 years ago now was that humanness seems to have, at least as we can see it, two separate dimensions, two separate ways of understanding it. One, this idea which I call human uniqueness, which involves those attributes of humans which distinguish us from the rest of creation, from non-human animals. They tend to circulate around themes of being civilized, like politeness, around ideas of rationality or intelligence. We have great cognitive powers that a lot of other creatures perhaps don't. And also around the theme of restraint or self-control. So there's one sense of humanness, I'd argue, that's all about how people differ from non-human animals. And there's an entirely different sense of humanness based on what is core, essential, deep-seated and shared as a part of our nature. And this, I'll argue, contrasts us not with animals, but with inanimate objects or machines or robots or things like that. So if you ask people what the themes are that characterize human nature, the deep-seated nature we have and embody, it's things to do with emotion, it's things to do with vitality, with that vital spark, with our warmth, with our general emotionality. And we followed this up with a variety of studies, just trying to figure out what are people's intuitions about these two different sorts of attributes. And people do have different senses of where these different attributes come from. People think, again, whether it's right or wrong is irrelevant, we're just asking about people's intuitions. People think that uniquely human traits like politeness tend to be learned. They require a process of enculturation or socialization to develop. You do not come into this world polite, far from it. People often tend not to think that these traits are widely shared or prevalent in our society. We often think, well, politeness is great, but it's not universally held. And people tend to think that these attributes are less likely to be ones that are shared across all of our cultures, but rather see them as fairly specific to our culture. In contrast, people tend to see human nature traits as part of our innate, inborn humanness. They see it as part of our common or shared humanity, what we have in common as a species by virtue of being Homo sapiens, and universal across cultures. If you like, there's sort of two different senses of what being human is. It's an Enlightenment sense, on the one hand, science, progress, intelligence, ability on one hand, and a romantic, in the sense of romanticism, understanding based on heart and emotion and a feeling and vitality on the other. So all I'm trying to argue is that humanness may not be a single thing. There may not be a single answer to this question. What it means to be human might have at least two components. Now, of course, this might all just be a figment of the Western way of thinking about humans, or even the Australian one, or even the Melburnian one. Who's to know? So we thought it was the right thing to do, to see, are these two distinctive senses of humanness in some way shared across different parts of the world? And we gathered samples of people from not only Australia but also Japan and Korea, and simply asked them, gave them a bunch of characteristics, translated them properly into Japanese and Korean for those two samples, and asked people, are these characteristics unique to humans and or part of human nature? And there was very high agreement across the three samples in which kinds of characteristics are unique to our species and which kinds of characteristics are part of our deep-seated human nature. So it's not purely relative. There is some kind of shared coherence or meaning to these different ways of thinking about humans. And there are also deep underlying, if you like, almost metaphysical beliefs about these different kinds of traits. In each of these three cultures, people thought that the human nature traits were deep-seated, essence-like, defining attributes, inborn, shared among humanity. And the interesting new thing we found here was the core of many of the attributes that people define as part of human nature is human relatedness, human connection, being close, being caring, being related to others. Not being a heroic individual, not being a member of a collective, but being in a close relationship with individual other people. That seemed to be a core in all three places. Now, we were very gratified, having come up with this idea that maybe humanness was plural, that it had two distinct attributes, to find some validation in some other interesting work that was done by some colleagues in the US. We were also gratified that we published a year earlier than they did. What they did, Dan Wegner, Kurt Gray, and colleagues at Harvard, they did this interesting thing about what they call mind perception. And they did a study where they got a large sample of people and they presented them with an array of entities and asked them to judge whether one entity had more or less of a certain mental capability than another. Now, the entities you can see in the key on the right there, so you've got a baby symbolised by what would over there in America be called a pacifier, and here would be called a dummy, a chimpanzee, a dead woman, a dog, a fetus, a frog, a girl, God, man, that is the mind of God, a man in a permanent vegetative state, PVS man, robot, woman, and you. So people are making judgments about a range of mental capacities about whether one entity has more than the other. And through an elaborate statistical machine, they came up with this surprising idea that mind is not something you just have more of or less of in a unidimensional way, but there are in fact two dimensions of mind, which miraculously map really nicely onto ours. They call one of those dimensions experience. The vertical dimension in this plot is experience. Experience involves those mental states having to do with feeling, consciousness, the capacity to have pain, the quality of experience, the capacity to suffer and to be a morally relevant being whose suffering matters and we should care about. So as you can see, those things higher on this plot in this graph are seen as having more experience. So babies, chimps, dogs, little girls, women and men to a somewhat lesser extent, and the person who's doing the ratings are all seen as high in experience, and whereas dead people, robots and God aren't seen to have very much of this experience at all. They don't suffer, they don't have bodies, they're not conscious in the normal sorts of ways. The second dimension, the horizontal dimension, they called agency. Agency, maybe not the best title, perhaps, some might argue, was more to do with mental states involving intelligence, self-control, things of this nature, capacity to act with intention rather than just by reflex. So the further you are to the right, the more agency you have, the more ability, the more capacity to restrain your impulses and the like. So what this graph is sort of saying is it's visualising the placement of different kinds of minds within this two-dimensional space. People who have lots of agency and experience are human adults. If you have less agency but equal amounts of experience, you could be an animal or a child. If you have less experience but the same agency, you might be God. If you have less of both, you might be dead or a robot. So again, it's saying mentality and the extent to which humanness is grounded in having minds is not a singular thing, it's a plural thing. And I think it should be clear, I hope, that what they're calling agency is kind of like what I'm calling human uniqueness. What the horizontal dimension distinguishes between humans and non-human animals, like dogs and chimps and frogs, and the vertical dimension distinguishes humans from objects and inanimate entities. So there's some evidence that mind has two dimensions and that humanness is about mind and that humanness might therefore also have two dimensions. So I think this is hopefully interesting. It was interesting to me and it's, I think, not obvious. A lot of things in psychology become obvious if you think about them a lot, as you knew it all along, but you actually didn't until someone told you. So there. Let's move along from the idea of humanness to dehumanization, because as you would imagine, it doesn't make much sense to use the word dehumanization unless you have some idea what the humanization is that you're deing. What are we denying to someone when we're dehumanizing them? Surely it's their humanity. But surprisingly enough, until quite recently, academic psychologists at least who talked about dehumanization tended to do it in the absence of any kind of explicit understanding about what humanness was. Probably because it's such a hard question. But since this time, I think we've really moved forward. I think another thing I should say to begin with is that when people have talked about dehumanization in psychology, they haven't only lacked a formal understanding about what humanness is, what is being denied to the dehumanized person. They've also tended to see it in the context of very extreme behavior, torture, war, slavery, behaviour that is on the extremes of suffering and brutality. And I think what I'm going to present to you is some work suggesting that that may not always be the case, and we may need to expand our idea about what dehumanization is. And some of this work comes out of some really interesting Belgian social psychology by Jacques-Philippe Leyens and co. They coined this ugly term, infra-humanization. Infra meaning sort of less than or below. And they didn't want to use the word dehumanization because they thought they were talking about a milder version of a denial of humanness to people that didn't quite rise to the level of dehumanization, wasn't necessarily involving brutality or hatred or killing or genocide, but was nevertheless meaningfully a denial of humanness to other people. And what they did was some very interesting research, which I'm sure all of us would love to do. They essentially visited a whole bunch of cafes in Belgium, and they accosted random people in cafes and asked them, what is the nature of humanness? And I guess this perhaps happens a lot in French-speaking parts of the world. I don't know. I mean, I think you'd be quite taken aback if you were approached by some stranger and asked about the meaning of humanness. But people did this in Brussels and Louvain-la-Neuve, where they did this. And what they found again and again was that people in cafes, at least, whether they're representative of humanity, who knows, tended to list three kinds of things that were human. One was intelligence. One was language. You know, we speak, they grunt. And one was refined emotion. So the French have this distinction that we English speakers don't, between emotions which are seen as being unique to humans, which they call sentiments, and those which are seen to be shared with other species, which they call emotions, as we do. So they thought, let's look at whether people tend to ascribe sentiments, ascribe uniquely human emotions to other people or not. To give you an idea about what these primary and secondary emotions are. Primary emotions are, in theory, emotions which are shared with other species, other mammals. Secondary emotions are those which are understood to be somehow unique to human beings, and this is independent of or separate from the idea of emotions that are positive, that is enjoyable to experience, versus those which are negative. So the idea is something like this: happiness and excitement and anger and fear you might see in an ape or a dog, but you would only see joy, gratitude, guilt and nostalgia in humans. So to the extent that we do not ascribe those uniquely human emotions to members of other groups, we are subtly seeing them as less human than we are. And sure enough, what Lyons and company did in a large number of studies was they showed that, sorry, I must have moved. Start again. I may have missed a slide here, my apologies. What they repeatedly showed was that people tended to deny uniquely human emotions to members of other groups, even when there was no history of conflict or no present conflict with that other group. They studied mainland Spaniards judging people from the Canary Islands, which is Spanish territory. And the mainland Spaniards saw the Canary Islanders as lacking the capacity for secondary emotions. We all have primary emotions, but only we, the mainland Spaniards, have uniquely human emotions. And the Canary Islanders did the same thing back to them. They thought that they, the Canary Islanders, had the capacity for uniquely human emotions, and the Spaniards lacked those things. You see the same thing French and Germans and French. Routinely, there's a subtle tendency to see members of out-groups as lacking humanly unique emotions relative to in-groups. And so we call this infra-humanization because it's a mild, subtle part of group perception where we reserve full humanity for members of our own group, as revealed in the kinds of emotions we ascribe to others. Now, so this work on infra-humanization is making the argument that there are subtle forms of dehumanization, subtle ways in which we deny uniquely human characteristics to others, and that's important and maybe has real behavioural implications. And the Belgian social psychologists showed a number of ways in which infra-humanizing others did have troubling consequences. But remember, I'm saying there isn't just one way of thinking about humanness. There's not just humanness as what distinguishes us from animals, there's also humanness as what distinguishes us from objects. And if that's the case, there should be two different kinds of dehumanization. There shouldn't just be dehumanization where we liken some people to animals or see them as more animal-like than us. There should also be a kind of dehumanization where we deny people human nature and see them as more like objects or automatons or robots. And sure enough, there's been a great deal of research since that time validating and extending this idea that different kinds of groups or individuals can be seen as less human than others in these two separable ways. And I'm not going to give a big overview of the psychology of dehumanization, except to say that it's grown very, very rapidly over the last decade. And just to sort of give you a flag of the kind of things that tend to come up, there's some work showing that subtle, some unconscious forms of dehumanization can have real impacts. Laurie Rudman and Chris Mesher at Rutgers University in the US showed that young men who unconsciously associate women more with animals or objects have a higher propensity than others to perpetrate sexual harassment and sexual violence. There's lots of work on social class showing that people of lower SES groups, chavs in the UK, white trash in the US, bogans in the Australian context, these stereotypes are largely populated by animalistic traits. Even in the absence of a strong negative, demeaning view of other people, we tend to ascribe stereotype content to these people that is the same thing as the kind of attributes that distinguish apes from human beings. A lot of work shows that in the context of inter-ethnic or inter-religious conflicts, both parties tend to see the other party as less human than they are, and the more you do that, the more you advocate for and support aggressive policies towards that outgroup. And there's been some really powerful work on this in the context of the Middle East. And there's been lots of work also in terms of how people tend to perceive immigrants and refugees and other displaced persons, showing that a dehumanization of those groups, seeing them as less refined, seeing them as primitive, seeing them as lacking uniquely human attributes, tends to go along with a less welcoming stance and tends to be driven by emotions of disgust and contempt. Let me give one example just from our own work. You do find that there is a tendency for people, even liberally minded people who go to art galleries like us, to have non-conscious associations or unconscious associations which see Indigenous people or traditional people as in some way less fully human than others, that modernity somehow makes you more human than not being a full part of modernity. A lot of this work was motivated by some terrific work by the Scottish psychologist Gustav Yehoda, who wrote a book called Images of Savages, arguing that a lot of the colonial era ideas about others, ethnic others, racial others, as being somehow primitive and not fully human, hadn't just been consigned to the dustbin of history, but persisted in our unconscious thinking, so that we tended to see people from Indigenous or traditional society backgrounds as either noble savages, where we tend to see them as kind of childlike in a condescending or patronising way, or as ignoble savages, where we see them more as beasts and brutes and unrestrained animals. And we looked at this question using some research tasks that are probably a little bit tedious to go into. Essentially what we did was we came up with some images of people from traditional societies, people living in traditional societies, most of whom were Indigenous to their area, versus people from the same world regions who were living in industrialised societies. Give you an idea about what this looked like. We matched them for age, control, ethnicity. They're both. So the top row is the traditional societies grouping. The bottom row is the industrialised societies grouping. They were sort of averaged, or at least I should say balanced for age, perceived attractiveness, and various other things. And we just simply used a computer-based task to see, do people tend to associate one group more than the other with animals, with children, and with uniquely human traits. Here are the male versions. This is just a sample of some of the faces we used. And sure enough, and you have to sort of, I guess, believe me on this, we did find that people were university students in Melbourne, most of whom would abhor the idea that they had any kind of racist bones in their body, did unconsciously associate the traditional society people, the people with Indigenous backgrounds in most cases, more strongly both with animals and with children. So the bars in this diagram represent the strength of the unconscious association as revealed by reaction times in this particular task. Let's think in particular about the ape metaphor. Some of you will know the appalling history of so-called racial science in the colonial era, some of which had a tendency to view people from the colonised societies as somehow lacking in full humanness, as being intermediate between apes and humans, and did a lot of skull and brain measuring to try to justify that prejudice, which of course would support the idea that these people needed to be civilised and dominated. And again, you can say, well, maybe that was then and this is now and everything's changed and these things leave nothing but history books. But that may not be the case. It's also not the case that it's necessarily something that only is restricted to perceptions of Africans, although that's where much of the research attention has come from. Here's a cartoon, and I can't tell you exactly how long ago it was, and you have a man who's supposed to be Irish, looking at a chimpanzee behind bars, and the hard-to-read caption at the bottom says, both. In other words, they're both saying it to the other. And it's glad I am that there's bars. The idea being the chimpanzee is glad he's protected from the Irishman and vice versa. You similarly see very simian depictions of Irish people in this image of a riot from an Irish riot on St Patrick's Day in 1867. Very much sort of ape-like depictions of people, not based on sort of racial otherness as we might understand it now, but on just differences of ethnicity. And of course, the ape metaphor comes out also in the context of war. Often the other side is seen as being violent, bestial, a mad brute, and you see similar imagery in some of the sort of iconology of the Japanese during World War II. So we tend to bring out this ape metaphor sometimes to refer to people who are more primitive, less civilised, more physically threatening than us. And again, you might say, well, this is all in the past, what about now? This terrific American social psychologist, Philip Atiba Goff, has done some work suggesting that maybe it's not completely dead, it's not just in history. What he asked was, is it the case that modern Americans, even those who are or claim to be unaware of the idea that African-descended people have been likened to apes, do they still hold on to that kind of unconscious association in some way? And so he investigated what he called the African ape metaphor, did a variety of studies that came out about a decade ago, strongly supporting this idea. He again used methods similar to the ones that I didn't tell you about in relation to the perceptions of traditional people, looking at the strength of unconscious associations between different racial groups and, in this case, apes, and showed that there was a unique association among his white American participants between African faces and apes, and not white faces and apes. And likewise, it wasn't just animality in general. It wasn't that there was also an association between African American faces and, say, dangerous big cats like tigers and lions. It was unique to apes. It wasn't just savagery in general, animality in general. And he showed that this actually matters. In a second study, he showed participants a video of a police beating of a suspect, and the suspect was racially ambiguous. And in one condition of the study, he showed people first an image of an ape, in the other condition he didn't. And independently also of that, some participants were told the suspect is black, and some were told the suspect is white. What they found was participants who were both primed with this ape concept, making the idea of apes salient, and who were told that the suspect was black, saw the beating as more justified. And the logic has to be something like this. If you see the person as this kind of dangerous beast, then it makes sense. And if it aligns with your non-conscious view that African Americans are a little bit bestial, that makes you think a violent response to that kind of person is justified. It also happens in the news media. They did some follow-up in Philadelphia, where I lived for 14 years, where they looked at how ape imagery colours media reporting of crimes committed by African Americans, and showed that a variety of sort of jungle type terms linked to apes, animal, ape, barbaric, beast, bellow, brute, etc., were more common in depictions of crimes committed by African Americans than by white Americans, and also the more that kind of jungle imagery crept in to media depictions of the crime, the more a death penalty verdict tended to be given in the case, holding constant statistically things like crime severity and mitigating circumstances. Now, all of this is arguing, Goff is arguing that somehow this African ape metaphor is in the minds of white Americans and possibly black Americans as well, suggesting it's sort of out of awareness. But maybe people are actually quite willing, in some cases, to explicitly refer to some people as less civilized, more primitive, more ape-like. And that's what's been done by the social psychologist Noor Khatili from Kellogg University in Chicago. He gives people a task like this, where he just gives you a famous ascent of humans diagram ranging from the sort of knuckle-dragging ape who scored 0 to the modern human, scored 100 with 3 intermediate steps, and simply asks people on this slider, indicate on the slider where you think the average American is, where the average Arab is, where the average Chinese person is, where the average Muslim is, etc. And you would be surprised and shocked to know that very often the average rating in samples of just ordinary people like you and I of particular groups is 70 or 80, meaning that a significant minority of people are not giving the obvious answer, which has to be 0. Sorry, not 0, 100, Freudian slip. In other words, many people are seeing these groups, demeaned groups, as being lesser humans, not entirely human, in a very blatant kind of way. And it's not just something that people do, it's something that has real consequences. What they show is that the people who tend to give low ratings to members of outgroups, who see outgroups as being more primitive by giving them low ratings, tend to be people who prefer social hierarchies, who see social hierarchies as more legitimate. And it relates to and predicts a variety of important things, like how much people support Muslim immigration or Arab immigration in the States, how much they advocate for preemptive drone strikes, how much they accept inappropriate incarceration of African Americans, how much in Hungary, where they've replicated this sort of work, people think that it's appropriate to discriminate against the Roma. And importantly, I think as well, the extent to which you give a group a low score on this task is not just an indication of how much you just generally hate them or dislike them. It goes beyond hate and dislike. The extent to which you see people as less human on this task predicts some of these dreadful behaviours over and above how much you dislike them. It's not just prejudice. It's not just an indication of prejudice. It goes beyond prejudice, beyond dislike. It's a particularly toxic combination. I'll skip through because I think I'm going a little bit behind time. But I think one of the key things that Katili and his researchers have shown is that this stuff happens in cycles. That if I dehumanise you, you're likely to dehumanise me back. And if I think that your group dehumanises me, then I'll repay the favour. And you get these unpleasant dynamics where groups that dislike one another tend to have this vicious spiral towards mutual denigration and mutually seeing the other as less than fully a member of our species. Of course, animal metaphors aren't always objectionable and unpleasant. So, we use pet names to refer to one another, often a bit saccharine, kitten and things like this. And we have totemic animals for our sports team. So I can say I'm a hawk, not meaning I literally think I can fly through the air and catch mice, but that my team is called the Hawks. Or we can refer to people as being sort of lion-hearted or having some other kind of attribute that an animal metaphor captures. But is that the case all the time? And of course it isn't. And we sort of know that a lot of examples from history contain very offensive non-ape metaphors for others, often to do with vermin, with insects, even with sort of bacteria and things like that. And you'll all know the story about the Rwandan genocide, which really was supported by the idea that the Tutsis were portrayed as cockroaches who needed exterminating by the fomenters of that genocide. We've actually done some work on this and shown that animal metaphors are really quite diverse. Again, this graph is not self-evident, but what I've said is, I've looked at is how offensive is this metaphor according to people who are asked, how offensive is it to call someone a pig, a cat, a dog, a chicken, or whatever. And you find that there's huge diversity in the perceived offensiveness of different animal metaphors. They mean different things. But the ones that are most offensive, especially chimps and apes and cows and leeches and slugs and rats, are of two different types. Animal metaphors, likening someone to a non-human animal, is generally seen as offensive either because the animal itself is disgusting and revolting and reviled, like with vermin, or because the comparison itself is seen as being dehumanising. Calling someone an ape, likening someone to an ape is offensive not because we think apes are disgusting, but because somehow making that comparison is a sign that someone else is lower on this hierarchy than we are. Whereas likening someone to a maggot or a rat is more to do with transferring the taboo disgustingness of that beast onto the person. So animal metaphors are diverging, they have different meanings and they're offensive for different reasons. And if you sort of take the average of all of the different metaphors, we studied 40 different metaphors and made judgments. What does this metaphor say about a person if you call the person by that animal name? It's got a few core themes. Calling someone an animal, the idea of animality in general, is about saying these people are depraved, they're brutally immoral, they're stupid, they're disagreeable, unfriendly, and they lack conscience. So when you use that kind of animal metaphor in general, given the diversity of different animal metaphors, part of what you're saying is these people lack restraint, lack intelligence, lack friendliness, lack conscience. Animality is seen as a deficit. So on to this exhibit, just for a couple more minutes. I think there's a bit of a puzzle here because, as I've said, a lot of the research suggests that animal metaphors, likening people to animals, is demeaning. And we also know separately that people tend to react pretty badly to hybrids. We tend to like categories which keep themselves apart, not ones that merge together. So why do Patricia Piccinini's sculptures not convey that kind of sense of a negative comparison or of revoltingness of these hybrid beings? Despite all these infrahuman, the non-human touches in these hybrids, they often have snouts rather than noses, an important anatomical difference. They have tails. They have stegosaurine backs in some cases, or razorbacks. Their ears are long and floppy in some of them, like a pig's. Their hair is unkempt and maybe thicker than yours or mine. And they're often depicted in their nakedness without the humanizing feature of clothes. And I think there's a few reasons. I mean, one is there's also all these humanizing touches, and to me, what really strikes me from these sculptures is the eyes. They humanize in pretty much every case. I haven't done an inventory, but they tend to be human, and we often forget human eyes are special. If you look at primates in general, we are the only species where we have whites in our eyes. I shouldn't say lower, maybe I should, other primates have black, it's called sclera to use the technical term, black sclera, and the evolutionary biologists say one reason why that is the case is that they've evolved in societies where deception is key, where there really is a Hobbesian war of all against all, where if you had whites of an eye, it would show other baboons or monkeys or chimpanzees where you were looking, and that would be to your disadvantage. Whereas humans are said to have the whites in their eyes to aid communication, to make it easy for others to see where we're looking so we can cooperate. We are a more cooperative, related kind of species, less driven by these concerns about rampant deception. And to depict humans with sort of hybrids, as in these sculptures with human eyes, I think is giving this humanizing touch by noting this importance of cooperativeness and the fact that eyes really are the window into the soul. We do attend to gaze of others. We do tend to see people's eyes as being really revealing of them being like us. And I think also the warm colours and that luscious pink skin on these sculptures is also important. But more important even than that is the behaviour. So many of these sculptures in this exhibit are showing nurturance, supporting, carrying, cuddling, caring for others, demonstrating attachment to children, the sorts of things which are at the core of human nature, as I said earlier. Relatedness is what really captures the core of human nature, and these sculptures, commonly speaking, are relating to others in warm, nurturing, caring ways. So I could make the argument that these peculiar hybrids are actually revealing human nature, paradoxically, that they're showing that we have this shared mammalian inheritance that's part of what makes us who we are. It may not make us distinct from other creatures, but it is part of our essence, if you like. The focus on their bodies emphasises human nature rather than this focus on disembodied cognition. And the way that sculptures like this particular one, I think especially, focus on this special importance of relatedness, which really is core to what constitutes human nature, even as judged by people in very individualistic societies like ours and the United States. So in a sense, what she's doing in these wonderful sculptures, I think, is presenting animality not as a deficiency, not as a lack of agency, a lack of self-control, a lack of intelligence, a lack of moral character, but rather as being equal to us in human nature. High up in this graph, we're all the same. Animals and humans, and babies and children, we all are high in experience, high in relatedness, high in the capacity for emotion, and I think that's what this exhibit means to me.